Hey there, students. Tom Richey here with the Bill of Rights Institute for another evening of A-Push review, of live review for A-Push. Now, let me go ahead and start off with a few notes here, okay, because the AP Euro exam happened today. Now, the embargo on talking about the exam, to the best of my understanding, is not like it is usually. It's basically an hour after the exam. We can discuss it. We can talk about it. And so, usually it's a 2-day embargo. One thing that we want to understand about AP Euro is that, what that can be applicable to A-Push is, first of all, AP Euro, there were several prompts. Okay. So different students got different prompts. We're hearing a variety of prompts that are kind of spread throughout the course, but not exactly throughout the course. So one thing that we want to think about is we want to think about that we're not looking at what's the DBQ topic going to be? What do you think the DBQ topic is? That we're seeing that what I'm hearing about is at least, yeah, so as far as that goes, I'll get a Google Doc ready as I talk about this. But yeah, so what we want to understand is there could be a number of prompts. Now, one thing that I'm also seeing, and then again, we don't want to write anything off. I'm just passing to you the information that I have so that you can do with it what you will. Okay. So we want to, I want to give you the best information I have so that you can do with it what you will. The other thing here is that none of the prompts for AP Euro that I can hear, that I hear going around were past, gosh, hair's getting really long now. But I think the barbershops can open again next week in South Carolina. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel. None of the prompts were after 1850 or so. So the thing is that there were a number of prompts, but none of them really got into territory where some classes might not have gone. Okay, so I've had a theory as far as that. Now we're still going to get into, I think that it's important for us to, review the stuff that is right up, on the exam into the 20th century. But, we'll see, as far as that goes, we really could see some prompts that include the 20th century. So we don't want to write this off. Now, I would counsel you to spend your own time, reviewing, especially like the 19th century, the American, the Revolutionary period and all of that. But let's use this time to make sure that we cover our bases in case some of you get a DBQ that is in the 20th century. Okay, I think that is unlikely, but at the same time, let's make sure we're spending this time. Now, another thing is that the DBQs on the AP Euro exam, they were, the DBQs on the AP Euro exam were about the same as any other time. The time frames were not longer. The time frames were not longer. The time frames, they weren't like overall thematic. So they were basically the same kind of DBQ that we've seen on other exams. So that's another thing that we want to keep in mind, that when we see that other DBQs, have had prompts from like 20 to 45 years, that we're probably looking for something that will be about a, 30 to 50 year period is what we're probably going to be looking at there. So with that, let me go ahead and get into, so imperialism, World War I, and let's see, so imperialism, World War I, and the Roaring Twenties. Okay. All right, so let me go ahead and share that, and the Bill of Rights Institute will be putting a link out very soon, okay? So I just wanted to pass that information to you, but we still want to make sure that we are getting ready for the exam. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and kind of think about like social impacts, okay? And I'm going to try to spend some time, what you're going to see on these 20th century broadcasts is I want to spend some time also relating this to other periods of US history so that we can get the overall context, okay? So when we think about the social impacts of World War I, okay, so social impacts of World War I. First of all, I would say here that you've got the 18th and the 19th Amendment. Okay, so I would say that those two amendments, I would say, are products of World War I. So the 18th Amendment and the 19th Amendment. Okay, so the 18th Amendment and the 19th Amendment. So with the 18th Amendment, what we want to note about that, let's see. So line space, just add a little space after. Okay. So, and then I'm going to project. Y'all like me to project. Okay. I'm learning the system. Y'all like the Google Docs. Glad y'all find it helpful. Y'all should be able to kind of have these on file in case they might be useful for you. Okay. So with that, let me go ahead and get my screen sharing here. And we're good. I tell you, I'm down to one subject now. Euro's over, but I'm just exhausted from the Euro grind. You'll probably see a little bit more well-rested version of me a little bit later. So the 18th Amendment basically is prohibition. Okay, so when we think about this, that drinking, okay, so basically consuming alcohol was seen as like a European or especially German thing to do. Okay, so like alcohol consumption was often associated with German and German and Irish immigrants. Okay, so when we look at this, that you've got kind of a nativist sort of thing. Now, this isn't something that was necessarily like, okay, prohibition was totally a result of World War I, because you understand that temperance goes all the way back to the antebellum period. But this is a time, like one thing that we could note here is that the number one foreign language taught in schools today is Spanish. Okay, so when you think about this, that there's kind of a sort of maybe de-Germanization, if we were to think about that, because if we think about the Espionage and Sedition Acts, okay, so we see some things. I would say something like a de-German. And I'm kind of just answering your question, going on a little bit of a limb here, but de-Germanization, like, German used to be the most common foreign language. Okay, so foreign language taught in American schools. Okay, now what we want to note here is that the Espionage and Sedition Acts, okay, so these were passed, not the same as the Alien and Sedition Acts, but the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Okay, so the Espionage and Sedition Acts were passed, were passed during the war, which, basically they banned the display of the German flag. Okay, so basically it's like displaying the flag of an enemy was seen as a criminal act. Like sometimes I chuckle a little bit because I'll see somebody like, we've got a town that's got a lot of people with German ancestry nearby. And, every time I see like a car that's got a German flag on the front license plate, I just kind of chuckle because I'm like, that was illegal during World War I. Okay, so basically the banning the flag, and then we think about also Frankfurters. Okay, so this was the time when Frankfurters were renamed hot dogs. Okay, that basically a hot dog is a Frankfurter sausage. And so this is something where we basically, when we eat hot dogs, we are eating a German sausage, but it's like we don't need to say that we're eating a German sausage, right? So you see this like de-Germanization of the United States. Now note here that like Germans, okay, so German Americans make up the single largest, the single largest group in the United States. Okay, so the single largest group, group in the United States. Okay, now not so much, people don't refer themselves to German Americans, but Americans of German ancestry. Okay, so ancestry make up the single largest group of, makes up the single largest ancestry in the United States. Okay, so in terms of national origin. Okay, now that is at least if England and Scotland, okay, are divided. Okay, so that's one thing. Like what we want to note here is people that come from Britain, there are more people who trace their ancestry back to Britain than Germany, but if you divide England and Scotland, then that can be seen as so that's kind of an interesting thing here. So when you look at this, that like the alcohol consumption was often associated with German and Irish immigrants. Okay, so there was support. So basically, while there was support for prohibition before World War I, basically the war, brought support basically increased support. Okay, so the war increased support to the point where the Constitution could be amended. So that's one thing that I've seen is like when you think about what if scenarios, what if the United States hadn't gotten involved in World War I? It's entirely possible that prohibition would not have happened. And prohibition is kind of one of the things that defines the 1920s. And so as far as that goes, then we go on to the 19th Amendment. Okay, so the 19th Amendment, of course, is women's suffrage. Okay, so now we note again that, suffrage had started in the West. Okay, so what we want to note here is suffrage. If you get something that deals with westward expansion, that is another thing that you can note. Suffrage began in the late 19th century in several Western states. Okay, so basically several Western states, that by the time the 19th Amendment passed, was ratified, most states west of the Mississippi, and actually in that case, okay, so most states west of the Mississippi. So most states west of the Mississippi were had already, okay, so had already, had already legislated women's suffrage on the state level. Okay, so basically, just to note here, when we look at the 19th Amendment, and this is something that when we think about the pioneering experience, okay, when we think about the pioneering experience, this one's maybe I should have looked up, women's suffrage in the United States. Okay, so women's suffrage in the United States. I think this is where we're going to see the map here, just to kind of note, because I think this is just a very interesting thing about how how this works. Okay, so let's see a map. Let's see. Okay, so this is a promotional map in the US and Canada. And actually, let's see, women's suffrage US. Gosh, I need to learn how to Google, don't I? Okay, so map. Women's suffrage in the US map, okay, by state. And so that's, so here's something here. Well, this is NEH.gov, so that should be fine. It's a government website. And so 1919, basically what you're looking at here. Now, there is a political cartoon that I've seen this before, that this is, in the 1915. And what you see here is that, women's suffrage is marching, okay? Basically, women's suffrage is marching from west to east, okay? So yes, that's fine. I want to see this. All right, so you see from west to east, basically these Western states. Wyoming was the first one. Now there's a DBQ that I wrote on women that was more thematic in its approach, and we see with that, that on that DBQ, I've got a quote, a document that deals with Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin, who was the first, female member of Congress, and she came from Montana. She was serving in Congress by the time that women's suffrage was ratified. And so with that, let's see, do we have another map there? I think we can scroll down here. Let's see. Okay, well, never mind. But anyway, I think I've given you enough there. West to east, and largely driven by this pioneering experience. Note here that, you can see here this map that I don't know why we are, why we cannot, let's see, image in a new tab, and that's going to give me so what we see there is, this map where it's basically in the east and not just the south. You notice New York is 1917 before that, so it's basically the East Coast where there was still this cult of domesticity. On the frontier, you're not doing the same, seeing the same thing, because on the frontier, you see that women are, much more, the roles of men and women are not as differentiated out on the frontier. So a very interesting sort of thing there. All right, so with that, that is an interesting question. Somebody has got, Keelan, you've got a question. Were any of the Euro DBQs similar to the ones that have happened in the past few years? Not that I know of. yeah, the cards are still falling into place. People just started talking about it before I went live, but from what I can tell, we didn't necessarily have any DBQs that were from recent. Yeah, so I don't think you're going to see like the same DBQ topic as like in the last 3 years. Now, they could do it from the same time period. Okay, so that's why you just want to kind of think about that, and they could be inclusive of something, but we don't want to try to game it too much, because at the end of the day, you're going to have one DBQ topic put in front of you. So it's not so much about eliminating. Now, another thing is that just because the topic of a DBQ is different, okay, just because the topic of a DBQ is different, then it doesn't mean that stuff that was relevant to that DBQ won't be relevant to another DBQ from the same time period. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So although we saw one recently on the progressive era, what's to stop there being something on like women's suffrage, where some of the progressive era stuff may be relevant. So as far as that, will we be able to print out our documents? Grace, technically, yes, you can print out your documents. But as far as that goes, we also want to note here that printing out your documents is going to take time. And you don't necessarily want this to take time in terms of, it could be 3 minutes. The other thing is, what if your printer messes up? Okay, what if your printer messes up and there's something that, some kind of malfunction, and you were counting on the documents to be printed? Now, if you go to, if you just search for APUSH DBQ, let me see what we're going to see here. So if we search for APUSH DBQ, I'll go ahead and give you, okay, let me go ahead and go to this. This is a link. My friends at Marco Learning have this here. I'm going to share this, share this with the Bill of Rights Institute so they can share that. Marco Learning setup guide. Okay. So basically what I've got here, this is a resource that is going to be helpful to you in terms of being able to annotate the documents and set up a strategy for yourself. So the thing is, now, if you want to print your documents, I think that's okay. If you want to print your documents, that's fine. But what we want to do here is, think about that. You can't guarantee your printer's going to work. You may not want to waste the time. So what I'm doing here in terms of this is we are, going through and screen reading, but we've got an annotation sheet here. Now you can also replicate this on a Google Doc. That's something we did in a previous session where we were focusing on the, in a previous session where we focused on how to put together a DBQ. And so with that, we go from, briefly summarize the document, what argument could be used, and then for 2 documents, the POV. Now, the other thing is, remember, unless you have done this under timed conditions and you've replicated 10 out of 10 multiple times, then, that's the thing. But anyway, with that, let's just go ahead and we can go through there. And then I think the setup sheet here, the pre-writing worksheet, I think if you don't use this sheet, if you don't want to handwrite, I think that's fine. But make sure you've got some kind of variant here that you are, looking at body paragraph number 1, body paragraph number 2, and making sure what's my evidence from the documents to support this argument. Where's my outside evidence? I usually recommend putting outside evidence at the end of each body paragraph. That way it clearly differentiates the outside evidence from the body paragraphs. So with that, we'll just go ahead and see. I think I've got some other questions coming in. Excellent. Okay, so then we see here where flappers initially shunned by the public. Okay, so what we want to note here is the 20s are kind of an interesting thing here. When we think in terms of, let's see. So let me note here just while I'm finishing that up. Let's see. We need to share the screen again because I'm going back to the document, right? Okay. So going from there. All right. So suffrage on the state level, and women's suffrage in the United States was part of a global trend. Okay. So states was part of a global trend. Okay, so this is something that's going on across the globe. Now, when we think about the cultural shifts in the 1920s, okay, that remember that Warren G. Harding, okay, so Warren G. Harding, elected as president in 1920, promised a return to normalcy. Okay, so a return to normalcy, because what we're noting here is to kind of set this up that you had had the progressive era, World War I. So, you had, after the progressive era and World War I. Okay, and so what we want to note about this is, first of all, we note the progressive era brought in a great deal of political change. So if we're thinking about this, where you see periods that become a bit more conservative, right? And they're after times of rapid expansion or change. So when we think about the progressive era, and then we think about World War I. Okay, so as far as that goes, the progressive era and World War I, that the progressive era resulted in a great deal of political change that redefined one, the relationship, government's role in the economy, okay, in terms of regulating business. And, we think about too, the relationship between, basically the relationship between the federal government and the states. Okay, now when we look at the relationship between the federal government and the states, we want to note there also the 16th and 17th Amendments. Okay, because when you think about this, the 16th and 17th Amendments, these are, with the 16th and 17th Amendments, the 16th Amendment is the income tax. And so the income tax is basically, now the federal government can tax individual incomes without going through the states. Now, strictly speaking, before the 16th Amendment, an income tax could happen. Okay, conceivably an income tax could happen. And so, but the income tax would have to be levied equally on each state by population. Now, we know today that the value of $1 in California is not the same as the value of $1 in Alabama. $1 is going to go further in Alabama. California has more, wealthy people, and you already see that there are, economic inequalities. And so basically, the way the income tax would have had to been collected under the original Constitution, like when we look at the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, what we see here, let's see, so going from there, let's see. And some people think it's funny that I like Wikipedia, but I find Wikipedia to be the most accessible source of information. I don't, when it comes into that, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states. Okay, so without apportionment, of the several states. So, with that, we see that this without apportionment among the several states, okay, without regard to any census or enumeration. So that's what you're looking at there, that it basically made it unworkable. So with that, we see that, we're seeing the income tax now can be on individuals. So the government doesn't have to go through the states anymore. Now, the next thing is if we look at the 17th Amendment, okay, so we look at the 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution, what we're seeing there is that now the senators are going to be directly elected. Okay, so the senators are going to be directly elected instead of elected by basically appointed by the legislature. So before the 17th Amendment, what you had here, and this really changes, and this is where we can kind of talk about the Constitution a little bit, and the Constitution as it was originally written. What we want to understand about that is that the framers of the Constitution what they were trying to do is they were trying to create a balance of aristocracy and democracy. What they were looking at is, models of government that went back to Aristotle, that basically we need the House of Representatives that is not only a portion based on population, but also directly elected by the voters. And then we've got the Senate, which is divided between the states, but also is appointed by state legislatures. So this is like basically the Senate was not directly, there was not a direct link between the Senate and the voters. It was indirect through the legislature. And so the framers thought this was a way to make sure that, remember, the framers thought of democracy as kind of a dirty word. It's something we need a democratic element in our government, but we don't need a democratic government. That it really starts in the 1820s where we see a push for democracy. Okay, we see a push for democracy. So that's something with that we're going to note about the progressives. That the progressives wanted government to be more democratic, more responsive to the people. And so basically, but there's a lot of change there. And so Warren G. Harding, has this very attractive message to a lot of people about this return to normalcy. So we see here as we go through, World War I, what we're seeing there is World War I was the first time the United States had ever participated in a European war. Okay, so we note here that afterwards, now I've got a video, it's an old video, but I would say it's probably one of my first like halfway decent videos, perhaps. That what we see here is the, after the war. Okay, so after the war, the United States Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles, and did not put the, did not join the League of Nations. Okay, now I've got two videos that are relevant. I've got one, Wilson versus the Senate, the Versailles Treaty debate, and I've got another one that is about the 1920s in particular. Okay, so I've got another one that is about the 1920s and 1920s foreign policy. What we want to note is that does not mean that the United States stopped interacting with the rest of the world. A lot of people like to use the term isolationism, but we do see in the 1920s the Washington Naval Conference. We see, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which we can kind of laugh at now. The Kellogg-Briand Pact says basically we're not going to have any more wars. And so as far as that goes, that's, so the Kellogg-Briand Pact, we're not going to have any more wars. And so we see how that went, right? And then the Dawes Plan. So the United States is still, still engaging with the world. Okay, so foreign policy. Okay, so foreign policy, 1920s. Okay, we think about the United States is still engaging with the world, but on its own terms. So a few things here: the Washington Naval Conference, the Dawes Plan. Now that is different from the Dawes Act, right? The Dawes Plan, note that's different from the Dawes Act, which was what broke up the Indian reservations at that time, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So there are several international agreements, but its own terms, participating in several international agreements. Okay, so we see there that we want to note that we've got these things here. All right, so foreign policy in the 1920s. That's just a little thing there. And so with that, we've got this. So with that, we're going to get into, with that, let's go ahead and go for now. But we want to, I was taking the long route to the question about flappers. Okay, so I was taking the long road to the question about flappers. So what we want to understand here is the 1920s, were anything but normal. Okay, so we see social upheaval, okay, in the 1920s. So we're going to note first of all call the Great Migration. Okay, so we're going to see here the Great Migration of African Americans from the South. Okay, now note here that this is World War I to 19. Basically we're seeing that throughout, during and after World War I. Now, one thing to note here, this is something that, we always hear about, Southern racism after, after Reconstruction, during Reconstruction, which is definitely something that is, that is legitimate, as far as, this was a thing. But at the same time, what we want to understand too is the first time that the rest of the country has to deal with racial diversity. We see here that there are race riots in Chicago. Basically, now note that they were seeking jobs. Okay, so they were seeking jobs in education and to escape lynching. Okay, this is really the high point of the of the lynching debacle in United States history. Okay, that basically there is a record number of African American men who were being hanged without trial. The federal government really did not interfere here. Now we would note here Ida B. Wells. Okay, we want to know about Ida B. Wells, who was a muckraker who documented the lynchings in the South. Okay, so you want to make sure that you know about Ida B. Wells. But we're going to note here, while they were running away from racism in the South, they were meeting another racism. So we see that, there were race riots, okay, race riots in Chicago and other cities. Okay, so that's one thing that's happening here. Then, of course, you've got the first Red Scare, which this is the only Red Scare you need to know about this year. So after World War I. Okay, so basically this was fear of a communist revolution in the United States, basically initiated by radical immigrants. Okay, so the thing is, remember that the new immigrants, okay, so new immigrants during the Progressive Era came from Eastern Europe. Okay, so a lot of new, so many of the new immigrants, during the Progressive Era came from Eastern Europe. So with that, we've got here that, they believe that radical immigrants are going to bring about a revolution. And what we're seeing here is that the Palmer raids, okay, so the Palmer raids, against, basically U.S. government raids on radical immigrants, okay, resulted in deportation, of hundreds. Okay, so basically hundreds. I believe I'm correct. Hundreds being deported. Deportation of hundreds, often without due process. Okay, and that's of course something that is when we look at the United States today, people typically get due process in the United States whether they're a citizen or not. People don't typically think that, okay, due process is reserved for only citizens. But you see here, that's the Palmer raids were part of this first Red Scare, okay, this fear of a communist revolution that could happen there. Now we note here is, that we have, cultural, we have some kind of, sort of, can we call it hipster culture? I don't know, that these are, new cultural developments. Okay, so new cultural developments. We have jazz, okay, which was at that time, seen as scandalous and for young people. I often say that, jazz in the 1920s is almost like the gangster rap of the 1920s. That this is something that it's hard for us to understand, because today we think about jazz as something that's classy. When you think about somebody who listens to jazz, you're thinking in terms of, like Ron Burgundy, like I have several leather-bound books or something like that, and my apartment smells of rich mahogany. So that's something that we may, that we see there, that jazz was something that was for young people. It was seen as, as scandalous and trendy and that sort of thing. So he's about to type about the first Red. Let's see. So yes, okay. Typed about the first Red Scare. Teddy Roosevelt's big stick. Yeah. So with that, now Maya, I think I do have a video on the Imperial Presidents somewhere. Okay. So YouTube. Let's see. Let me just see if I've got that video out there. Okay, this should be something that could be helpful. Let me see if I'm able to put a YouTube link into this or not. Okay, so let's see. Okay, I can't do that, but I'm going to go ahead and send that to the Bill of Rights Institute. If you put in Imperial Presidents Tom Richey in YouTube, you'll be able to find this, and it's a pretty short video. Goes into that. I would recommend taking a look at that. Because I go into differentiating exactly what you're getting into there. And so with that, basically, now one thing that we want to note about that, I think, is let me go ahead and think about in terms of foreign policy. Let's think about just Teddy Roosevelt versus Woodrow Wilson. Okay. Teddy Roosevelt versus Woodrow Wilson versus like George Washington. Okay. So let's think about this. Like three presidents go into a room together. Okay. So Teddy Roosevelt, or basically George Washington. And again, let me project my screen there. Okay, so as far as that goes, all right. And so with that, let's see. Okay, so George Washington, then Teddy Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson. So George Washington is what we would call, what people would say, isolationist. Okay. Now I always put this in quotes because remember, this is something that is meant to be insulting. Okay. So this is something that is meant to be insulting. It's not somebody would say that about themselves. Okay. So this would be like a nationalist foreign policy. Nationalist foreign policy, Wilson being more internationalist. Okay. So the thing is that George Washington, would say like, stay out of World War I. Okay. So George Washington would have said, stay out of World War I. Teddy Roosevelt would say, get into World War I. Okay. So get into World War I to defend American interests. Okay. So to, defend American interests. So get into World War I, defend American interest, to preserve American neutrality. So we want to preserve neutrality and stay out of Europe and not get involved in their entanglements. We want to avoid foreign entanglements. That's probably better there. Avoid foreign entanglements. So avoid foreign entanglements, then get into World War I to defend American interests. Now, then we see here, get into World War I to make the world safe for democracy. Okay. So that's something that we see here with Teddy Roosevelt. He was somebody who was like a nationalist interventionist. Okay. So when we look at this, that, what Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson would have in common, this mouse. Okay. So what they would have in common is that George Washington was a non-interventionist. Okay. And this is where I say that, normally you will, you're going to find the natural contextualization for whatever prompt, but, the natural contextualization for whatever prompt is going to be a bit different than, it's usually going to be right before that time period or right at the beginning. But in this case, if we're talking about foreign policy, like George Washington, because it's not just Washington himself, it is this tradition that started with George Washington that was, pretty much kept for the most part. That when Europeans kill each other, it's not the business of the United States. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was an interventionist, okay? So, and then so was Woodrow Wilson. So you want to note here that basically Teddy Roosevelt with the big stick foreign policy. If we're thinking about what was Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy, what it is we are intervening in the world to make the United States more powerful and to defend American interest. Now, Woodrow Wilson, when he made his, his speech, his war message. Now, of course, he talked about how the unrestricted submarine warfare was an unnecessary violation of neutral rights. Okay, that basically neutral rights in the United States had been, had been compromised here. But at the same time, he said, make the world safe for democracy. Now, what we want to note going into World War II, and we can talk about this a little more tomorrow, is that World War One, World War One did not. Okay, so did not make the world safe for democracy. And a lot of Americans had buyer's remorse for getting involved in a European, in what was seen afterwards as a meaningless European war. Okay, that basically Europe was put in a worse position than they were, than they had been in. And really the United States could almost be seen. I mean, there are different ways to argue this. This is an argumentative point, but you could certainly make a point that the United States getting involved in World War I might have been part of the impetus for the Versailles Treaty and the mess that it was, because without the United States tipping the balance in favor of the Allies, then you might have seen a negotiated peace or something like that. Now, again, we're getting into what ifs and might haves, but when we're understanding like 1930s foreign policy, as somebody noted that the United States gets a bit more like what we call isolationist, later in the 1930s, as Europe's gearing up for war again, the United States is like, no, we don't want to get involved in that war. So when we go from there, the flappers, okay, so I hadn't got, I'd mentioned jazz, we need to get to the flappers. I was taking a long road for the flappers, okay, and so we see here that, flappers are another one of these cultural developments. So some young women, not necessarily all, but some young women began wearing short skirts. Now, these are, when we think about short skirts, these would be skirts that would not be short by today's standards, but they were not ankle length. Okay, so they're wearing skirts that basically show their, they show their calves, and this is something that women were not expected to do. Think about like, you look at like, Southern belles before the Civil War wearing those hoop skirts, and that they didn't show, it's like to show a man her ankles was seen as like, kind of like scandalous, like a man's not supposed to see a woman's ankles. And so short skirts, began to wear short skirts, smoke cigarettes and go to dance clubs. Okay, so and go to dance clubs. So as far as that goes, they began to wear short skirts, smoke cigarettes, go to dance clubs, and that's something. Now we need to note also that that we also see that traditional, this is not the end of traditional womanhood. There are all of these appliances that are coming out. So, traditional womanhood is not going away in the 1920s. Now, we also want to note here that when we're looking at the Great Migration, the first Red Scare, we could also note the Scopes trial. Okay, so evolutionary theory, and the Scopes trial. Okay, and that of course happened when Tennessee was basically banned the teaching of evolution, or even the teaching of anything that is not consistent with the creation story in the Bible. And so we see that the Scopes trial, the Scopes trial represented something that was this culture war in the United States, that we basically see like modernism versus fundamentalism. Now, fundamentalism is basically, a very traditional form of Christianity that stresses the literal interpretation of the Bible. Okay, so very traditional Protestant Christianity. Note here, Protestant Christianity. Fundamentalists typically do not see Catholicism as legitimate. So we see a lot of anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic sentiment here in the 1920s. So very traditional, Protestant religion that emphasizes, traditional Protestant religion, that emphasizes the literal interpretation of the Bible. Okay, so basically now modernism, of course, this is getting into where a lot of people are, becoming, irreligious, like, very, new forms of, of thinking that, modernism, these people, people who read, influenced by modern philosophy that rejected, rejected Christianity. Okay, so modernism rejected Christianity, or, or at least, I'm going to put something here, or at least traditional versions of it. Okay, so you've got basically, this idea of a modern kind of way of thinking, but a pushback from, from the fundamentalist. And then finally, we would see the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, now the Ku Klux Klan, I'm going to note here, what we want to clarify here is we're talking about the second Ku Klux Klan. Okay, so the second Ku Klux Klan, the first Ku Klux Klan had gone, defunct. Okay, so the first had gone defunct after Reconstruction. And we want to note as well the influence of the movie Birth of a Nation. Okay, now Taft's foreign policy is known as dollar diplomacy. Okay, dollar diplomacy, where basically Taft's main objective was to look out for American business interest. Okay, Taft's objective was to look out for American business interest. And so with that, basically in Latin America, we've got business interests there that need to be defended. And so that was his point of view there, that dollar diplomacy. And of course, on that video that I linked, just type in Tom Richey, Imperial Presidents, and I go into a little more detail on those foreign policies. And I just want to let that video stand on its own since it's relatively short. It's just a little 6-minute video, and it gives a comprehensive analysis of that. So with that, going from here, did World War I end the progressive era? I would say that World War I, it does kind of like slam the progressive era shut. Okay, that you start to see, and this is where we we kind of look at all where things go one way, people want it to go another way. And then people are kind of, a little bit tired of that. So James, you think about what we talked about in European history, that you got like the French Revolution with the Reign of Terror. And then you had the old regime before that. Then you go to the Reign of Terror, and Napoleon's like, let's find something that's kind of a happy middle. And so, yeah, the progressive era is kind of the, the progressive era is typically defined as, 1890 to 1920 or 1900 to 1920, depending. So now imperialism cartoons that we might get on a DBQ. Maya, the DBQ 2 years ago was on imperialism and included 2 cartoons. And for that reason, I would refer you to 2018, but I would say that it is extremely unlikely that any DBQs are going to be about imperialism this year. Now, they could take another DBQ from the 20th century. We could see World War I on a DBQ. I really don't see it. We will go over some basic points tomorrow about the Depression and World War II, because we want to be prepared for that eventuality. But I'm really not seeing that they're going to step right up to the line. Now, I may have some more information to give y'all tomorrow about AP Euro. Like I said about AP Euro, they closed the course off at 1914. And from what I'm hearing, none of the DBQs that were put out there stepped right up to 1914. So, that's something that it seems like the College Board is trying to be cognizant of being safe in terms of making sure that they don't get into territory that some students didn't cover in class. Because if you were in a class that let out and y'all were in the progressive era and your DBQ is about the Depression, then that could be the difference. Now, yes, what's the difference? Now, this is really getting a little bit more into writing. Veronica, I would refer you to the previous broadcast that we did where we were getting into the previous broadcast where we talked about the DBQs. The Bill of Rights Institute may be able to put some links to those in the chat, but I basically went through like entire DBQs. We've also got on Marco Learning's YouTube channel, I've gone through a DBQ, so that's something to note there as well. So with that, the first Ku Klux Klan had gone defunct after Reconstruction. And so what happened here is that Birth of a Nation. So in the 1915 film, Birth of a Nation, glorified the Klan and made it look heroic. Okay. So basically the second Klan, so the second Klan was inspired, was inspired by this, basically, was a kind of an echo of the first Klan. So the second Klan was founded largely, made the Klan look heroic, forming part of the causation for the formation of the second Klan. Okay, but note the second Klan was unrelated to the first Klan. So the second Klan was founded basically, by white Protestants to counter, in order to counter perceived threats to Americanism. Okay, so what they thought as true Americanism. That basically true Americanism is, basically white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Okay, so when we think about this, white, Northern European Protestant. Okay, so that's basically what they're, what they're looking at there, white Northern European Protestant. And so basically true, threats that are seen to this, such as modernist philosophy. Okay, so modern philosophy, Catholicism, immigration, and internal migration. Okay, so internal migration by African Americans. So when we think about the Great Migration, that is one of these things that's happening during this time. So basically, you see here modern philosophy, Catholicism, immigration, internal migration. So all of these things are being seen as something that needs to be defended. Now we'll note here that the Klan declined. So the Klan declined after 1930, after several leaders were found guilty of, of crimes. Okay, so basically, like, this is, for example, a Klan leader in Indiana was found guilty of rape. Okay, so basically, he's, part of this organization that claims that they're founded, that they respect women, that they're protecting women. And then one of the leaders of this organization is found guilty of rape. And so as far as that goes, that's what, that should kind of get us up to speed. Now let's see what else we've got here as far as any other questions I've got here. Okay, so as far as supporting the argument, so Veronica, there are three things that we need to do here when we think about what we need to do with documents. Now you can go to my APUSH DBQ page. Okay, so DBQ 2020. Let's get that going here. Let's see. Okay, so APUSH DBQ rubric 2020. Okay, so going from there, we've got here the APUSH DBQ 2020. And so going with that, let me go ahead and go to my web page here. You could go to basically, you see now if you put 2020 APUSH DBQ rubric, okay. So 2028 push DBQ rubric, you're going to see one of my videos here, or not my video, but you'll see my rubric that I'm about to put on screen here. So we're going to take a quick look at this. There are three things that you need to know with the documents. Okay, so as far as that goes. Now, Angela, I'm not sure what we're talking about in terms of the world market. What you do see during the progressive era is we see that, you see with the progressive era that during Wilson's administration, when the income tax is passed, you see that the tariff is lowered. So one thing you're going to note here is in the progressive era, American manufacturing is at a point where it doesn't need to be protected by tariffs. And so the US enters the world market, at the time when there are basically surplus industrial goods that need to be put out there. During the Civil War and into the Gilded Age, the emphasis was on protecting the US industry from foreign competition. But we're seeing at a point where, basically US manufacturing capacity is more than what is, what's available, the people that are able to buy it. And so the US wants to get out there with all of this surplus industrial production. And also crop prices had gone down because farmers weren't able to export their crops because of the tariffs. So the United States during the progressive era goes in the direction more of free trade and abandons the high tariff policies of the Gilded Age. And so with that, when we look at the rubric, contextualization theses are the same way. Now, three things you need to do. You need to describe a document, which means that you need to show that you understand its content. Supporting an argument, the basic thing there is if your description of the document makes sense in light of the overall argument, so in the topic sentence, then what you're going to see there is you're supporting the argument. Now, when we talk about the POV plus, what we want to understand here, and let me go ahead and share something. I can share something here that let me show y'all some setup, and I'll make sure that that is shared. That's some setup, and then they'll put this in the description later. I believe they'll add these links that I'm sharing to the description so that y'all can see these later. But what we want to note here is, let's get this link out there to y'all, and then yeah, so Teddy Roosevelt, it's the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, note we did a broadcast on imperialism a couple weeks ago. So if you look through the Bill of Rights Institute's AP Prep webinars, we did one, and sorry if y'all feel like I've kind of shorted imperialism tonight. We did one where we were basically focused on the development of U.S. imperialism and foreign policy in general. So as far as this goes, what we want to note here, and I've shared this, and that'll be shared in the chat by the Bill of Rights Institute, is this shows you basically going through this whole thing. We've got a sample response that I've put together there. So with that, we see contextualization thesis. Now, topic sentence, your paragraph, if you're using the documents argumentatively, they're being used to support arguments. You're not just like document 1 says, document 2 says, that you are saying. So we note here, Reconstruction resulted in meaningful and lasting social change in terms of the abolition of slavery, property rights for women, and public education in the South. In his last speech, Abraham Lincoln urged Congress to accept Louisiana's proposed state constitution. Okay, so to accept Louisiana's proposed state constitution, which did not provide suffrage for freedmen, but did abolish slavery and set up public education system for all races. Now we note here that I've got an argument that's talking about abolishing slavery, public education. And then note here, that's my description of the document, and it's done in a way that obviously supports an argument, okay? So I've described the document, and it fits into an argument that's being made. The supports point is largely based on, is there a topic sentence, okay? Is there a topic sentence? And so then notice here, now I'm doing my POV plus HIP analysis. Lincoln's audience was the radical Republicans in his own party who believed that abolishing slavery was not enough. and that the former Confederate states needed to be punished and forced to grant full citizenship rights to African Americans. So I go into audience analysis here. So as far as that goes, you want to, some documents you're going to, use something after where you're explaining this document further. You're going beyond just showing this here, what the document says, and you're going behind what the document says in terms of point of view, context, audience, or purpose. And so we see here that then notice that I tend to put my outside evidence at the end. And then we see here that okay, so in 1866, so although there was substantial social change as a result of the Civil War, resistance to change from Southern whites and apathy in the North resulted in social change being limited. In 1866, Robert E. Lee testified before Congress, saying he believed that if the federal government forced Southern states to allow Black residents to vote, it would create hostility between the races. Okay, document 2. Since Robert E. Lee had been a Confederate general and was looked at almost as a god by Southern white people after the Civil War, his view of how the Southern whites would react was very likely accurate and is supported by resistance efforts during Reconstruction, such as the formation of the KKK. So here I get into point of view and historical context. Now remember, you only need to address POV, context, audience, or purpose, but you'll probably address more than one of those when you're doing this. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we've got tomorrow kind of a Great Depression, World War II, and wrap up. Okay, so we want to be able to wrap up. We may take some more general questions. So the thing is, we don't want to forget about that stuff, and it's stuff that a lot of people may not have gotten in class. So we will focus on some kind of basics of the Depression, basics of World War II. But then again, I've also got some notes on those things, I think, from some of my Corona classes that I will be sure to share as well. So with that, I'm thankful to the Bill of Rights Institute for having me on once again, and am looking forward to bringing our webinars to a close tomorrow. It's always a pleasure.